Good morning. I'm not going to play any games on my channel today. Instead, I'm going to pay a little tribute to Danya Naroditsky. I'll just be honest right from the start. I can't pretend to have been the biggest fan of Danya ever. I wasn't subscribed to his channel, but I did watch his stuff fairly regular. That was kind of a luxury thing when I had time to watch it. I've never come away from one of his videos without having learnt something more about the game. But the strongest things I came away from watching Naroditsky's videos was what a nice, kind-hearted, funny, generous, warm-hearted person he was. You know, one of the things he done which from somebody without Russian origins might seem a little racist was sometimes he spoke in the voice of a Russian grandmaster and said things in a really funny way. Yeah, he was a Russian. I'm not sure if he was himself born in Russia or if his parents emigrated before he moved to before he was born, but his parents were definitely from Russia and Ukraine. But also very, very warm-hearted, very, very passionate about chess. A good player, one of the best, one of the best quick players in the world, and a classical chess grandmaster. A fantastic chess educator and a good coach. You really do learn things, and he does cover things in a really direct, straightforward way, which is understandable for many, many people. A great, great, great chess coach. My first knowledge of Daniel Naroditsky didn't come from his YouTube work. It was watching Chess Network Jerry cover bullet battles on Lee Chess, and on Lee Chess he was known as Rebecca Harrison. Was incredibly quick and some fantastic battles with particularly Magnus Carlsen. And I really was impressed by that. And when I found out that bloke was also a YouTube streamer, I began watching. But I'm not going to go ahead and say that I watched all the time. I was a subscriber and I was a big fan and all that. I think one thing that chess should teach us is honesty. So yeah, honestly, nothing against the bloke. I really liked everything he done, but I can't claim to have been the biggest fan in the world. That's my problem, not his. But anyway, really, really sad that such a talented, kind-hearted, generous, passionate young man should die. Not even 30 years old. I know he's got a wife. I don't know if he's got children. If he's got children, I feel so sorry for his children, but his wife, that must be absolutely devastated. Anyway, that's what I had to say. I think we should look at some chess from Daniel Naroditsky. I picked out what I thought was the best of his. As I'm not the biggest fan in the world, it was difficult for me to find games that were the best. But I found a game which chessgames.com said was one of his best, which was against another Russian American grandmaster, Grigory Oparin, who is second to Fabiano Caruana and playing in the US Championships at the minute. The game was played in the Riga Open and was classical chess. So let's see what happened. Naroditsky played e4, c5, Sicilian, c3, the Alapin. Yeah, this is something I like to play. I like to play the delayed Alapin as well. So, knight f6, and the pawn comes forward and attacks the knight. The knight comes forward, and the pawn comes to d4. And then the pawn gets taken, and the knight comes, and the knight comes. Eventually this pawn will get taken back. It gets taken back, and The pawn gets attacked on d6. Bishop comes out to attack the knight. He could have defended the knight by taking the pawn, and the queen would be defending the knight, but he decides to attack it directly and defend the knight at the same time. Bishop goes to b5 to pin the knight. The pawn's taken, and the knight hops in. The bishop blocks, otherwise he's going to be losing a pawn, and the knight is taken, and the queen takes. And the knight's pinned to the queen now. And the knight comes to c3. Yeah, he can't take here, of course, because of the pin. Pawn comes to e6. Maybe he's thinking that he can come bishop to b4, pin the knight, castle, and then take this pawn with the queen. So he castles, so the bishop comes to e7. That plan's not going to work anymore. There's no point. Queen to g4 immediate. Certainly when you watch in rapid play, was a keen attacking player, Daniel Naroditsky, and this is an attacking player's move. I'm going to play g4 whilst I've got the chance. Black castles. White could have played bishop here. It doesn't want to exchange in this case because the bishop can come to f6, but he prefers to get rid of the piece which is attacking d4 first. So taking with the pawn, and now he plays bishop to h6, but bishop to f6 covers the pawn and stops the mate. The rook comes to d1 to support again the pawn because it's attacked twice at the minute. And the rook comes to d1, and the knight attacks the bishop. So that, yeah. Queen comes to d7 to support the bishop. e7 even. Pawn on c6 is attacked, and the rook supports it. So both players are finished with their development. Both have a dark square bishop, a knight, a queen, and two rooks. Both have an isolated pawn. Isolated queen pawn for Danya, and an isolated c pawn for Grigory Oparin. It's a fairly even position. So the rook comes to d3, ready to come to, for example, g3. But f3 and h3 could also be powerful threats. Rook comes to d5, maybe ready to come to g5. Maybe f6, maybe just to double the rooks. So bishop defends the pawn. So the rook doubling won't do anything, and the rook uses the opportunity to attack the a pawn. Myself, I think the rook is a little bit isolated out there, and yeah, might be in danger of running short of squares. So the rook comes to, now that the pawn has moved, the rook can come to b5 and attack the b pawn. If it just attacked it straight away, it could have come to b3, and then if it attacked the a pawn, it could have come to a4, and then both pawns would have been defended, and both pawns would have been on light squares invisible to the bishop. So this is a slight improvement on that idea. And so the pawn comes to b4, and both pawns are defended, but they're both on dark squares, so that's slightly worse. Pawn comes to a5. Of course, when your opponent builds up such structures, you want to break them down. He's gonna, if he takes here, the rook takes, and this pawn becomes instantly weaker. So he supports the structure with the bishop, and the pawn pushes past. Yeah, again, this is all right, but from my point of view, I think c5 lights up, and the knight coming to c5 cuts the rook off from all further participation in the game. But he sports with the bishop first. Can't argue with him, knows much more than me. And the rook comes to d5, two attackers on the pawn with two defenders. So he's threatening maybe to play queen to e7, d7, or rook to d8. Probably rook to d6, queen to d7 first to support this pawn, then rook to d8, and then he might even look at moving the queen to b7. I might play queen to b7 and then rook to d8 immediately. So the queen defends the knight and attacks the c pawn. Yeah, expands on the king side and gives himself an escape square, Luft. Puts an end to the expansion and gives himself Luft. Notice he's putting the pawn, they both have put the pawns on white squares where they can't be seen by the opposing bishops, so that's very sensible. The pawn comes to e5, he's proposing a trade. In the event of a trade, he's most likely just going to take with the bishop, or the bishop, I think, not the rook, but who knows. But he doesn't trade directly. He proposes a more complicated trade where he trades off the rooks. The knight attacks the rook, and the rooks are traded off. And the pawn takes the rook, and the knight takes the bishop first. And the knight takes back. Queen attacks the rook on c5, c8, sorry, instead of just swapping off directly. Queen comes to e6, proposing a trade, and Danya is agreeable to that trade. This means that his pawn doesn't get isolated, but it gets taken anyway. And now this backwards pawn, this pawn which is called pawn is called backwards when it can't move into a position where it's defended by another pawn, can't advance to a position where it's defended by another pawn. Well, of course, pawns only advance. But this pawn is fixed in a backwards position. Alright, it's on a light coloured square. The bishop doesn't see it, but the rook might see it, so we'll see what happens. The knight comes to d7 to attack this pawn, which is defended by the f pawn immediately. So, yeah. And that structure is attacked by g5 and defended by g3. And Parin immediately takes advantage of the open second rank by placing a rook on the second rank. It's a good move by Danya. You could think, okay, I'll just play here, but then black just plays here, and this pawn is really difficult to defend. Instead, he puts the knight here so that he can try placing the rook here to suggest a swap. So the pawn's taken, and it's taken back, and the king comes to the centre, and the rook swap is proposed. Oparin says no thank you, and the bishop attacks the rook. Rook comes to b2, and the rook comes to c7, attacking the knight. King comes to e8. I could have played rook to a7 to attack the pawn, but then rook comes here to attack the bishop, and when the bishop moves, this pawn falls. So he does it this way so that he's threatened to say check when he takes the pawn. So king comes to f7, and the bishop attacks the rook now from a new square. And now if the rook comes here to attack the pawn, or comes here to attack both pawns, the answer is the same. The rook can come to c3 and defend the pawns. So a bishop comes, rook comes to d2, and the bishop attacks. Check, and the king comes diagonally out. Yeah, he wants to be able to get to this square, in the event of a check to defend this pawn, and he wants to be able to threaten to cut off the king there. So the pawn comes to d4. Very good. Makes the advance whilst they can. And brilliant response from Naroditsky. It's so tempting when your opponent attacks one of your pieces to do something about it. Retreat the piece, defend the piece that's attacked, block the attack. Instead, Naroditsky does the other choice, which is often the best choice, which is to make your own attack. And he attacks the knight with his rook. But not only does he attack the knight, but he pins the bishop at the same time. Great. So the knight comes to b6. If he takes the knight, then the bishop is taken, and black gets passed pawn. So he threatens the rook first, and then takes the pawn. Otherwise, yeah. But now black has the opportunity to play knight here and attack the rook and this pawn. That's exactly what he does. And instead of threatening the pawn here immediately, he threatens the knight, giving himself access to the good c6 square. c7 square, sorry. And now the pawn makes a move. Obviously, if the pawn is taken, the pawn comes to e6 and is nearer to queening. So instead, the knight comes to b5 to attack the bishop. He says check anyway, and then the bishop covers these two squares, which might be able to interfere with the potential queening of that pawn. So, smart move by Oparin. If he takes the rook, then the knight comes here check and forks the king and rook. But he pushes the pawn, and the rook comes to e4 check, and the king comes. Maybe tempted to come this way, but then again, if you come this way, this check will occur. So he takes the pawn, and the rook comes to c8, and now the pawn is threatened to queen and get a new rook, and if he comes here with the king to stop it, then the rook chases the king away, and the pawn becomes a new queen, and he has to give up the rook for it, and he'll be a whole rook up, and this bishop is placed where it is effectively stopping that pawn. He can always give up the bishop for that pawn, and yeah, there's nothing to fight on for. So a very, very fine win from a fairly early stage of his career. I think it was 2014. 11 years ago. He was 19 years old. Amazing that the man didn't live to be 30 years old, really. Amazingly sad. Anyway, that was a very, very fine classic win by Danya Naroditsky. Don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe to my videos. Thanks. Bye.